I'm Claire Anderson, 29 years old, and the night my parents turned me away was the night I stopped being their daughter. I stood on their front porch in the middle of a pounding storm, holding my twin baby girls against my chest, begging for a place to stay. My father's stare was as sharp as glass, and my mother's eyes slid past me as if I were a stranger. When the door closed, I felt the last thread of belonging snap. Out there in the rain with nothing but two crying infants in my arms, I knew my life would never return to what it once was. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments, and make sure to like and subscribe if you've ever had to keep going after the people you trusted most walked away. I grew up in a house where appearances mattered more than comfort, where polished floors shone brighter than laughter. My parents were proud of their reputation, proud of raising a daughter who made good grades, volunteered at church, and smiled politely in every family photograph. They believed in discipline and respect above all else, and for a long time I believed that too. By the time I was a teenager, I'd learned how to keep my head down and do what was expected, but deep inside I carried the hope that one day I would be seen not for their rules, but for myself. Life changed quickly after college. I married young, full of dreams that didn't last. When my marriage collapsed under betrayal, my parents saw it as a shameful mark on their perfect family name. To them, divorce wasn't just failure. It was a stain that couldn't be washed away. I thought maybe they would forgive me for the sake of my daughters, but when I knocked on their door that night, soaked to the bone, I saw the answer in their silence. They didn't want me anymore, and they certainly didn't want the reminder of my mistakes crying in my arms. I had no car parked outside, no wallet in my pocket, nothing but a phone battery running low. Every neighbor's house was dark, the street empty except for a flickering light at the corner. For a long moment, I stood frozen on the porch, unable to breathe, replaying every memory of the girl I used to be, the daughter who decorated Christmas cookies in that same house, the young woman who carried her wedding bouquet through that very doorway. But now that home was locked against me, I scrolled through my contacts, searching for a lifeline, though most of the names tied back to a life I no longer had. Finally, with shaking fingers, I called Julia, my old roommate from college. We hadn't spoken in months, but when she answered, her voice carried the kind of concern I hadn't heard in years. I told her where I was, that the girls were cold, that I had nowhere to go. She didn't hesitate. She told me to hold on, she was coming. The rain fell harder as I slid down the porch railing, curling myself around Emma and Lily, humming a lullaby through chattering teeth. Minutes dragged into an hour before headlights appeared on the street. Julia's old sedan splashed through puddles and stopped in front of me. She ran out with a blanket, eyes wide with shock and anger at what she saw. She gathered us into her arms, guiding me into the warmth of her car. That night, as I sat trembling in the passenger seat with my babies pressed close, I realized something my parents would never understand. They had closed their door forever, but somewhere else, another one had opened. And as Julia drove us away from the house that had once defined my childhood, I knew this was only the beginning of a story that would change everything. Julia's apartment was small, barely 700 square feet, but that night it felt like the only safe place in the world. Warm air wrapped around me the moment we stepped inside, carrying the scent of brewed tea and laundry detergent. She helped me peel off the soaked coat and passed me a towel, moving quickly as though every minute mattered. My arms ached from holding Emma and Lily, their damp hair plastered against their tiny foreheads, but seeing them finally start to relax in the heat brought a wave of relief I hadn't felt since the porch. "Sit down, Claire," Julia said firmly, guiding me toward the couch. "I'll find something dry for the girls." I nodded, unable to find words. She returned with 2 small onesies she had saved from her niece years ago, holding them out with a soft smile. They'll be a little big, but it's better than nothing." I stared at the clothes, surprised she still had them, then let out a shaky breath. Watching her lay out blankets and baby items she had gathered reminded me of how long it had been since someone acted without judgment simply to help. While she changed the babies, I stepped into the bathroom. The shower was hot and filled with steam, the first real warmth I'd felt all day. I stood under the water, watching the dirt and cold wash down the drain, my body trembling from exhaustion. By the time I returned, Julia had set up a makeshift bed on the living room floor with folded blankets for me and a laundry basket lined with towels for the twins. She placed a steaming mug of chamomile tea in my hands. "Don't worry about talking tonight," she said softly. "Just rest." That first night on the floor, listening to Emma and Lily's steady breathing, I couldn't stop my mind from replaying the porch again and again. My father's hardened expression, my mother's refusal to meet my eyes, the sound of the door slamming. It was all sharper now in memory than when it happened. My back ached from the floor, my body heavy with fatigue, but there was a strange stillness in that exhaustion. For the first time since everything had unraveled, there was nothing more to do but breathe and wait for morning. When I woke to the sound of Lily coughing softly, sunlight was pushing through the blinds in pale stripes across the living room. My neck was stiff, my body sore, but the girls were warm, wrapped in fresh blankets Julia had tucked around them. On the counter sat a new diaper bag stocked neatly with formula wipes and tiny diapers. Julia must have gone out early to buy them before work. A note on the fridge in her handwriting read, "You've got this. I left coffee and oatmeal. Call me if you need anything." The simple words steadied me, though the reality of my situation pressed down hard. I had no income, no car, and no clear plan for where to go next. Brandon had already emptied our joint account months before leaving me, with nothing but a ruined credit score and unpaid bills. Even thinking about calling a lawyer felt impossible when I barely had enough energy to keep the babies fed and comforted. So instead I focused on what I could control. I cleaned Julia's apartment, cooked simple meals, and cared for Emma and Lily through long nights of teething cries and restless sleep. I stopped crying after a few days, not because the pain lessened, but because the exhaustion left no room for it. I found a beat-up notebook Julia had picked up at a thrift store and began writing in it when the girls slept. At first, I wrote down the sharpest memories, the storm, the rejection, the look in my mother's eyes. Then I wrote about Lily's small hand curling around my finger in the dark, about Emma's faint whimper quieting when she pressed against me. Putting the words on paper made me feel present, even if I didn't know what the writing would lead to. Most days blurred together in that tiny apartment. I avoided mirrors because I didn't want to see the pale face, unwashed hair, and tired eyes staring back at me. Evenings were the hardest, when the quiet made my thoughts louder. One night, Julia came home and found me sitting on the couch with Emma asleep on my chest, staring blankly at the television. She sat down beside me and said gently, "You need something outside of this. Not out of here, but out of this fog." She slipped a flyer into my hand, her expression steady. "Writing workshop at the library. It's free, Saturdays." I thought of you the moment I saw it. I turned the flyer over slowly, reading the bold print twice before setting it on the table. The words on the page felt far away, as though they belonged to another person. "You used to be fire, Claire," Julia said quietly, standing to put her bag away. "Maybe you still are." That night after she went to bed, I sat in the dim glow of the lamp with the flyer still in my hands. I kept running my fingers along the edges, feeling the paper bend and spring back. A part of me wanted to toss it aside, convinced I wasn't ready to sit in a room of strangers. But another part of me, small and unsteady, wondered if this was the first step I had been waiting for, without knowing it. All week the flyer stayed on the table, catching my eye each time I passed. On Saturday morning, I bundled Emma and Lily into the stroller and walked the 3 blocks to the library. My heart thudded with every step, my palms damp, as though I were heading into something far bigger than a neighborhood workshop. Standing outside the glass doors, I almost turned back, but then I heard Julia's words again. "You used to be fire." I pushed open the door and stepped inside, unaware that the choice I made that morning would begin to shift everything. The library's community room was tucked away in the back, its door propped open with a folding chair. Inside, a circle of 10 metal seats faced a whiteboard that read in neat blue letters, "Your story matters. Let's begin." My heart pounded as I parked the stroller near the wall, double-checking that Emma and Lily were tucked in and fast asleep. I slid into one of the empty chairs, keeping my eyes low as the rest of the women greeted each other quietly. The instructor, a kind-eyed woman who introduced herself as Joy Miller, welcomed me without hesitation. "You're exactly where you need to be," she said gently before starting the session. Her calm voice steadied me, though my hands trembled as I opened the notebook I'd carried. When she gave the first prompt, "Write about a moment that changed everything," my pen hovered above the page, then began moving fast, as though the words had been waiting. I wrote about the rain, the porch, the sound of the door closing. I described Emma's soft whimper pressed against my chest and Lily's tiny body shivering in the storm. I wrote about my father's cold expression and my mother's refusal to look at me. The memory poured out in uneven lines, messy and raw, but truer than anything I had spoken in months. Joy invited us to share what we had written, and for reasons I still don't understand, I heard myself say, "I'll go." My voice shook as I began reading, but I forced myself to keep going. Each word felt like pushing against a locked door, yet I couldn't stop. By the time I finished, the room was silent. Every face turned toward me. One woman wiped at her eyes and whispered, "I've been through that too. Not the storm, but the rejection." The weight of her words settled over me like a blanket. For the first time since that night, I wasn't standing alone in the rain. Other women understood even if the details of their stories were different. When the workshop ended, Joy touched my shoulder. "You have something important, Claire," she said softly. "Not just talent, truth, and truth matters." Walking home with the stroller bumping gently over the cracks in the sidewalk, I felt a quiet shift inside me. The city looked the same, cars, passing people, walking dogs, but I saw it differently. For months I had been surviving hour by hour, focused only on the next bottle, the next diaper, the next night of broken sleep. Now for the first time, I wondered if there was more than surviving. That evening, after the girls were asleep, I reread what I had written. It didn't look like just pain anymore. It looked like a story. I pulled Julia's old laptop from the shelf and began typing piece by piece, shaping the memory into sentences that might reach beyond my notebook. I didn't know what I was writing toward, but I knew why I needed to remember that I had endured, and I needed proof that endurance could mean something. Days turned into weeks, and every spare moment after bedtime I typed. Sometimes just a page, sometimes less, but each line pulled me a little further out of the fog I had been drowning in. Julia noticed. One night she leaned against the doorway with a smile. "You're finding your fire again," she said, then left me to keep writing. Eventually she convinced me to share one of the chapters on a simple blog she helped me set up. We titled it, "Left in the Rain." I published the first post late at night, my hands clammy over the keyboard, half convinced no one would ever see it. By morning, 20 strangers had read it. By the end of the week, that number was in the hundreds. But it wasn't the numbers that mattered. It was the comments. Women wrote that they had stood on porches too, that they had been cast out, that they had carried children through nights of uncertainty. One wrote, "I thought I was the only one. Thank you for showing me I'm not." I pressed my hand over my mouth as I read, stunned that something so personal could echo so widely. Soon, a small online magazine reached out asking if I would share more of my story in an interview. I hesitated, unsure if I wanted that kind of attention, but eventually agreed. The article was published under the headline, "Left in the Rain: One Mother's Journey from Rejection to Resilience." The story spread quickly. More emails, more messages, even invitations to podcasts and forums followed. My words were no longer confined to a notebook. They were reaching people who needed them. Late one evening, after putting the girls to bed, I sat at the kitchen table staring at an email from a literary agent. She had read my posts and wanted to know if I had considered writing a book. The idea seemed impossible, but Julia nearly shouted with excitement when I told her. "Claire, you've already been writing it," she said. Her certainty steadied me, even as fear whispered about what my parents might think if my story grew larger. I closed the laptop and sat in the quiet apartment listening to Emma's soft breathing through the monitor. A part of me still flinched at the thought of making my story public, but another part knew the silence had already cost me too much. I wasn't writing to shame anyone. I was writing to remember that I had survived. And maybe someone else needed to remember that too. As I turned out the light, I realized the storm that had begun on my parents' porch was leading me somewhere I never expected. I didn't know where the path would end, but I knew I couldn't turn back now. The days after that first blog post felt like stepping into an unfamiliar current, one that carried me further than I expected. Each evening, after Emma and Lily finally settled, I returned to the keyboard. The clacking keys became a rhythm, a small anchor in a life that had otherwise been stripped bare. What started as scattered memories soon began to take shape. Julia would peek in some nights, her scrubs still smelling faintly of hospital corridors, and smile as she saw the glow of the screen. "You're building something, Claire," she would say before disappearing into her room. It was Julia again who pushed me past my hesitation when the email from the literary agent arrived. "She sees what I see," Julia said, nearly buzzing with excitement. "You've already written half a book without knowing it." I stared at the message, unsure whether to believe it, but her certainty steadied me. Over the next few weeks, I pieced together the blog entries, the notebook scribbles, and the late-night drafts into something resembling chapters. I called it Left in the Rain because that was the moment everything began to shift, though I wanted it to be more than just the night on the porch. The proposal made its way to a small independent publisher. I remember the afternoon their email arrived offering me a contract. The twins were napping, sunlight slanting across the couch, where I sat with the laptop balanced on my knees. My hand hovered over the mouse heart racing before I finally clicked to accept. It wasn't a major New York house, but it was real. Suddenly the story that had lived inside me was going to live in the world. The weeks that followed were filled with calls, edits, and cover designs. The publisher's team was kind and patient, guiding me through every step. The chosen cover showed a black umbrella reflected in a puddle, simple yet striking. I wrote the dedication late one night while the girls slept. "To my daughters born into storms, may you always find shelter within." When I typed those words, I knew that whatever else came of this, it would belong to them first. The official announcement went live on the publisher's site and their social pages. Julia shared it proudly, and friends from years past sent messages of congratulations. But beneath the rush of excitement, a knot of dread coiled tighter each day. I didn't speak it aloud, but I knew what was coming. It arrived in the form of a cream-colored envelope slipped through the mail slot with no return address. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable, my mother's precise and practiced. Inside was a letter 2 pages typed and clipped neatly at the top. It read, Like a formal reprimand, I had disgraced the family, embarrassed them before their church and community, and unless the book was withdrawn, they would pursue legal action. I stood in the kitchen holding the letter, the hum of the refrigerator suddenly deafening. My hands shook as I set the pages down on the counter. When Julia came home that evening, I handed her the envelope without a word. Her jaw tightened as she read. "You knew they'd react, but still—" "This is cruel," she said. I nodded, but the truth was the words still cut deeper than I expected. A few days later, the threat became official. A letter from their attorney arrived demanding I cease publication and accusing me of defamation and emotional harm. I laughed out loud when I read it, though the sound was bitter and harsh. "They left me outside in the rain with 2 babies," I muttered, "and I'm the one who caused them harm." The publisher responded immediately, assuring me of their support. They had seen this before, they said, especially when women wrote about breaking free from rigid or controlling families. Their legal department gathered everything: emails, messages, even photos Julia had taken that night when she found me drenched and shivering with Emma and Lily in my arms. Then there was the recording. The morning after it all happened, I had called my mother, desperate for an explanation. Her voice had been flat and cold. "We can't be associated with failure. That's not who we are." That single sentence saved on my phone became the anchor of our defense. The lawsuit was filed, and before long, the case became public. A local journalist covering women's issues picked up the story. The headline read, "Parents Sue Daughter for Telling the Truth About Being Left in the Rain." It spread quickly far beyond our city. People reacted not only to the drama, but to the deeper wound it revealed. Online hashtags like #LeftInTheRain and #NotYourShame began circulating. Book pre-orders rose sharply, and strangers sent messages of support. As the court date drew closer, I braced myself. Each day was a balance between the ordinary rhythms of bottles, diapers, and nap schedules and the looming shadow of a legal fight with my own parents. Emma and Lily would giggle on the playmat while I sifted through legal documents. Julia would help me pack diaper bags alongside folders of evidence. It felt surreal, as though I were living 2 lives, one of small, tender routines and one of high-stakes confrontation. When the day finally arrived, the courtroom was quiet but charged with tension. My parents sat on the opposite side, their faces carefully arranged into neutrality, but I saw the strain in their posture. Their lawyer argued that my writing had humiliated them, cost them their social standing, and painted them unfairly. Our side presented the evidence, the photos, the letter, the recording, Julia's testimony. When the recording played, the sound of my mother's voice filled the room. "We can't be associated with failure." Hearing it in that space with a judge and attorneys listening stripped away any pretense. It wasn't just memory anymore. It was truth. The judge's decision was clear. The book was not defamatory. It was protected as lived experience. Case dismissed. The gavel fell with a sharp crack, and the tension that had built for months released in a rush I hadn't expected. I turned to Julia, whispering, "I can finally exhale." My parents rose without looking at me, leaving the courtroom in silence. As the room emptied, I sat still, holding the court document in one hand and Emma's small stuffed bunny in the other. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like closing a door on the last remnants of hope that my parents would ever change. Yet even in that grief, I felt something else rising, a quiet certainty that their silence no longer defined me. The courthouse emptied quickly after the verdict, but the silence it left behind lingered like a weight in my chest. Julia walked beside me as we stepped into the hallway, her hand brushing my arm. I carried the folded court document in one hand and Emma's small stuffed bunny in the other. My legs felt unsteady, my breath thin as though my body hadn't caught up to what had just happened. That night at Julia's apartment, I tucked the twins into their makeshift beds and sat at the window, staring at the steady drizzle against the glass. The internet, however, was far from quiet. News of the court case spread quickly, and my story was once again being shared across platforms. Only this time, people weren't just reading, they were responding with their own truths. Women wrote about families who had cast them out. Men spoke of fathers who turned cold when they didn't fit expectations, and adult children described decades of silence after being deemed unworthy. One message in particular stayed with me. A woman had written, her parents didn't sue her, they sued their own reflection because they hated what it revealed. I read those words again and again, realizing how precisely they described what had unfolded. My parents had never been able to face the truth of what they valued most, and my story had forced it into the light. The morning after I woke to a new message request on Facebook. It was from a name I hadn't seen in years, my Aunt Clara. She had always been the quiet one in the family, present at gatherings, but never loud, never confrontational. My hands trembled slightly as I opened her note. Claire, I read your book. I believe every word. What they did to you was cruel. I'm sorry I didn't speak up back then. I'm proud of you now. My eyes blurred as I read the words, softening something that had felt hardened for so long. Over the following days, more messages arrived. Former neighbors, old classmates, even a Sunday school teacher reached out. Some admitted regret, others offered encouragement, and a few simply wrote, I see you. Not every response was kind, but enough of them reminded me that I was not shouting into an empty void. People were listening. A few days later, Julia and I took Emma and Lily to the park. The girls were strapped into the stroller, giggling as the sun filtered through the trees. A woman in her 50s approached us, a copy of Left in the Rain clutched to her chest. She hesitated before speaking. Are you her? She asked softly. I nodded, unsure of what to expect. Her eyes filled as she explained that her own daughter had left an abusive marriage the year before. I told her she was embarrassing the family, she admitted. But after reading your book, I called her. I apologized. Thank you. She hugged me, then a stranger whose life had intersected with mine through words on a page. It was brief, but it carried more weight than I could describe. When she walked away, Julia touched my shoulder. Neither of us spoke, but we both felt the ripple of what had just happened. My parents had tried to silence me, yet the opposite had unfolded. The story had opened doors of reconciliation for people I had never met. Back at the apartment, the emails and messages kept coming. Some shared stories of rejection, others offered gratitude, and a few were raw with ongoing pain. I read each one slowly, often late at night, after the twins were asleep, pressing my hand over my mouth as tears slipped down my face. For months I had carried the fear that telling my story was selfish or wrong, that it exposed wounds better left hidden. But now, with every message that began with "me too," I saw it differently. It was never just about me. It was about all of us who had been left standing outside a closed door. The attention was overwhelming at times, but Julia reminded me to step back when I needed space. She helped me set boundaries, encouraging me to choose which interviews to accept and which to decline. You don't have to say yes to everything, she said one evening as she washed bottles at the sink. The story has already done what it was meant to. Still, some opportunities felt too important to pass by. I agreed to a few podcast conversations, not out of desire for recognition, but because each time I spoke, another person might feel less alone. And each time, the twins were never far from my mind. I wanted them to grow up knowing that silence was not their inheritance. One afternoon, while scrolling through messages, I paused on one from a young woman named Danielle. She wrote that she had been considering returning to a harmful relationship until she read my story. "Your words stopped me," she said. "I realized I deserve better." I closed the laptop and sat quietly listening to Emma and Lily babble on the floor. That single message reminded me why I kept writing even when the weight of the past felt too heavy. The weeks after the court case carried a strange rhythm. Part healing, part exhaustion, part discovery. I began to understand that justice didn't always feel like triumph. Sometimes it felt like quiet, like waking up each day and choosing to build something steady. My parents had lost their power to control the narrative, but the ache of losing them remained. Yet within that ache space was opening for something new. By the time spring arrived, the rain had given way to longer days and warmer afternoons. Julia and I started walking the girls through the neighborhood more often, pushing the stroller past houses with blooming gardens and open windows. People nodded at us in recognition, some stopping to speak, others simply offering a smile. Each gesture reminded me that life was moving forward, carrying me and my daughters with it. I didn't know what the next chapter would hold, but I knew one thing clearly: the story was no longer just mine. It belonged to everyone who had seen themselves in it, and to the daughters who would one day read it. As I watched Emma and Lily reach for each other's hands in the stroller, I felt certain that the storms of the past had not won. Spring settled in with longer days, but beneath the warmth of the season, the noise around my story only grew louder. Articles about the court case circulated online, and my inbox filled faster than I could manage. Podcasts and blogs wanted interviews, and parenting forums debated my choices as though I were a headline rather than a person. Julia helped me sort through it, making coffee, while I sat at the kitchen table, clicking through dozens of unread emails each morning. In the middle of it all, one message stood out. A well-regarded publisher reached out asking if I would consider expanding Left in the Rain into a wider release. My first instinct was to hesitate. The legal battle had drained me, and part of me wanted nothing more than to retreat into the quiet. But Julia squeezed my hand when I showed her the email. "Claire, this is what you've been doing all along," she reminded me. "Telling the truth. You don't need to hide now." Over the next few weeks, I worked with the new publisher's editor, shaping the manuscript into something stronger. We went line by line, tightening the prose, clarifying timelines, and making sure the heart of the story stayed intact. Choosing the final cover felt surreal. It showed a dark umbrella reflected in a puddle, a quiet symbol of where it all began. Writing the dedication was the hardest part, though. After hours of revisions, I finally typed the words, "To my daughters, born into storms. May you always find shelter within." When the announcement went live, support flooded in again. Pre-orders doubled overnight. But just as quickly, a new envelope arrived in my mailbox. No return address, but the handwriting on the front was familiar, my mother's neat cursive, every letter perfectly shaped. Inside, the tone was as cold as ever. She accused me of disgracing the family, humiliating them in front of their church and neighbors. She demanded the book be withdrawn, or she would ensure more legal consequences followed. I set the letter on the counter and stared at it until the words blurred. When Julia came home, she read it too, her jaw tightening. "You knew this could happen," she said softly. I nodded, unable to speak. I thought the court case had closed that door, but seeing my mother's words on the page reopened the wound. A few days later, a cease and desist letter arrived from their attorney. This time the accusations were even harsher: defamation, slander, emotional harm. The publisher reassured me they had a legal team ready for this exact kind of challenge. They gathered the same evidence we had relied on before: the photos of me on the porch, soaked and trembling, the testimony Julia had given, and the recording of my mother's voice saying flatly, "We can't be associated with failure." Each piece reminded me that the story wasn't just memory, it was documented truth. News of the second legal threat spread quickly. A journalist covering women's rights picked it up, and the headline ran, "Parents Threaten Daughter Over Memoir Left in the Rain." The story caught fire online. Social media filled with posts carrying hashtags like #left in the rain and "truth is not defamation." People rallied around the book pre-orders climbing higher as readers posted messages of support. Strangers wrote that they had been waiting for someone to say aloud what they had carried in silence. By the time the next court date arrived, the case had drawn wide attention. The courtroom was crowded with reporters, advocates, and quiet onlookers who had come to see for themselves. My parents sat across the aisle, stiff and unmoving. Their lawyer argued that my words had cost them their standing in the community, portraying them as unloving and cruel. Our defense rested on the same foundation as before: lived experience. When the recording played, the judge leaned forward, listening intently. My mother's voice filled the room once again. "We can't be associated with failure. That's not who we are." It echoed in the silence that followed, heavy and undeniable. Julia's testimony confirmed what had happened that night, and the photographs spoke for themselves. The ruling came swiftly. The judge declared the book protected speech grounded in truth. The case was dismissed. The sound of the gavel struck like a door slamming shut, final and irreversible. I didn't feel triumph or celebration, only a weary release. As we left the courtroom, Julia asked quietly, "Are you all right?" I nodded, clutching the court papers. "Just tired in the bones," I said, and it was the truest thing I had spoken in weeks. That night I returned to the apartment, put Emma and Lily to bed, and sat alone by the window. The rain had returned softer this time, tapping the roof in steady rhythm. The storm no longer felt like judgment. It felt like memory. Online, my story was still being discussed, but in that quiet space, I let myself breathe. What I didn't know was that the next wave of messages would bring something I hadn't expected, not just sympathy or solidarity, but reconciliation, even from people I thought I had lost forever. In the weeks following the second court case, life settled into a rhythm that felt both fragile and new. Online, the conversation around my book grew louder, carried by hashtags and stories from strangers who had lived through their own storms. Each time I opened my laptop, I was met with messages of gratitude, confession, or simple recognition. Many of them began the same way: I thought I was the only one. One evening, while Emma and Lily were sprawled on a blanket with toys scattered around them, a notification blinked on my phone. It was another message request, this one from a woman named Danielle. She wrote that my words had stopped her from going back to someone who had hurt her. "I realized I deserve better," she said. I stared at the screen, my throat tightening while the girls babbled happily beside me. That night I understood that what had begun as survival for me had become a lifeline for others. Then came the message from Aunt Clara. We had spoken only through her single note of support after the first book release, but this time she asked to meet. I agreed, though my stomach knotted with nerves, as I walked into the small diner she suggested. She was already there, hands folded on the table, her hair streaked with silver and eyes lined with years of quiet restraint. "I should have spoken up long ago," she said softly as I sat down. "I let fear of your parents keep me silent, and I regret that." Her voice carried no defensiveness, only honesty. She admitted she had read both the book and the coverage of the lawsuits. "They made their choice," she said, "but you made yours, and it was brave." The words hit me with unexpected force. For so long I had lived with the sense of being cut off from every branch of family. But here was someone who carried the same last name telling me I wasn't wrong to stand where I had. We spoke for nearly 2 hours, the conversation wandering from childhood memories to the lives we had each built apart. When we parted, she hugged me tightly and whispered, "You're not alone, Claire. Not anymore." Encounters like that began happening more often. At the grocery store, a woman paused near the produce aisle holding a copy of Left in the Rain against her chest. Her voice shook as she explained that my story had given her the courage to apologize to her own daughter. Another time, while pushing the stroller through the park, a stranger recognized me and simply said, "You gave me words I didn't know I needed." Each moment reminded me that my parents' attempts to silence me had only multiplied the reach of my truth. The book tour requests followed quickly, but I declined most of them. I had no desire for bright lights or endless interviews. Instead, I chose smaller, quieter gatherings, community centers, women's groups, book clubs. In those rooms, the conversations felt real, not like headlines. Women shared pieces of their lives, and I listened as much as I spoke. Emma and Lily were never far away, their presence grounding me in every moment. Back at home, I began working on something new. It wasn't a direct continuation of the first book, but more a collection of reflections letters written from the perspective of someone standing on a porch, choosing to walk forward rather than back. I titled it The Quiet Revolution. It wasn't flashy, but it carried the same heart, the same steady pulse of rebuilding after loss. My publisher embraced the idea, encouraging me to shape it slowly, letting the words come as they wanted to. The second book made its way into counseling offices, high school classrooms, and support groups. It didn't go viral, but it didn't need to. It lived where it was needed, passed hand to hand, read in quiet spaces where people were looking for hope. That steady presence felt like justice in its own right, not a dramatic victory, but a lasting one. By summer, Julia and I had found a small bungalow across the river, a modest 2-bedroom with peeling white paint and a crooked mailbox. It was ours, the first space that belonged solely to me and the girls. Julia helped me move in her laughter, filling the rooms as we carried in boxes. I painted the nursery a soft lavender and covered the ceiling with hand-drawn clouds. When Julia walked in and saw it, she wiped her eyes. "You did this with yourself," she said quietly. I smiled, knowing what she meant. We hung the girls' finger-painted art on the living room walls, planted daisies in the yard, and built shelves from scratch. On one wall, I framed both editions of Left in the Rain. On another, I hung photos of Emma and Lily in every stage of babyhood, their laughter caught in still frames. And in the center, I placed a picture of the three of us in a field of sunflowers, the caption beneath it, "Simple, not perfect, just free." Life settled into a new rhythm there. Mornings meant cereal and cartoons, afternoons meant library visits and garden play, and evenings were filled with the quiet sounds of bedtime stories. Sometimes after the girls were asleep, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, listening to the soft tap of rain against the roof. It no longer sounded like rejection. It sounded like memory, gentle, steady, a reminder of what had been endured and overcome. Justice hadn't come in the form of my parents' apology. It had come in the form of truth told, silence broken, and a home rebuilt from nothing. And as I tucked Emma and Lily into their lavender room each night, I knew the storm had not won. Life inside the little bungalow soon found its rhythm. Mornings were filled with laughter and cereal bowls, afternoons with trips to the library or time in the yard, and evenings with the familiar sounds of Emma and Lily winding down for bed. The walls that had once echoed with silence now held giggles, lullabies, and the quiet hum of belonging. Some nights after the twins were asleep, I would sit on the porch with a cup of tea. The sound of rain often returned soft against the roof, steady in its rhythm. It no longer reminded me of that porch where I had once been left standing. It reminded me of how far we had come. The storm hadn't disappeared, but it had changed, no longer an enemy, but a memory that shaped us. By the time The Quiet Revolution was released, I had stopped worrying about numbers or recognition. The book found its way into book clubs, counseling offices, and the hands of people who needed it. It lived a quieter life than Left in the Rain, but that felt right. I didn't need noise anymore. What mattered was that the words could sit with someone in their hardest moment and remind them that they weren't alone. Emma and Lily grew quickly, their first steps taken across the lavender nursery floor, their first words spoken in the rooms we had built together. Each milestone was a reminder that we weren't defined by what we had lost, but by what we were building each day. Julia remained part of our lives, the kind of friend who could move between laughter and tears without missing a beat. And Aunt Clara stayed in touch too, a quiet thread of family that reminded me not everything had been cut away. Looking back, I realized justice hadn't come in the form of apologies from my parents because those would never arrive. Justice came in truth, spoken aloud in the life I was creating free from their silence, and in the daughters who would grow up knowing their worth wasn't measured by anyone else's approval. One evening, as Emma curled into my lap and Lily tugged at my sleeve, Emma looked up at me and asked, "Mommy, where do rainbows come from?" I kissed her forehead and whispered, "From storms that didn't win." In that moment, I knew the lesson had carried through. And so this story ends, not at the door that was closed against us, but here in a home filled with laughter, in days that no longer feel borrowed, and in the quiet certainty that storms may shape us, but they do not define us. Before we close, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever walked through a storm and come out stronger on the other side? Share your story in the comments. And if you found something in mine that stays with you, I hope you'll join me again for the next one.